Welcome to Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis, the podcast where policymakers, legislators, thought leaders, licensees, and advocates come to discuss the evolving landscape of cannabis in New York and beyond. I'm Herb Barbot, former Director of Operations in New York's Office of Cannabis Management. Each episode, we bring you in-depth conversations with key voices shaping policy, business, and advocacy, plus expert insights on the latest developments impacting the industry. And now for the episode. Welcome to episode 22 of season 2 of Joint Session. This is Herb Barbot. In this episode, we'll speak with Leah Sera, Associate Professor and Associate Dean at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. But first, as always, let's take a spin around this week's news. The United States Senate passed a spending package last week that, depending on what happens in the House, could have wide-ranging implications for cannabis. The fiscal year 2026 Military Construction, Veterans Affairs, and Related Agency Spending Bill includes language that actually aims to expand veteran access to medical cannabis. It reads, "None of the funds appropriated or otherwise made available to the Department of Veterans Affairs in this act may be used in a manner that would, 1. Interfere with the ability of a veteran to participate in a medicinal marijuana program approved by a state, 2. Deny any services from the department to a veteran who is participating in such a program, or 3. Limit or interfere with the ability of a healthcare provider of the department to make appropriate recommendations, fill out forms, or take steps to comply with such a program." This language differs slightly from the version of the bill that the House passed in June, so it will require reconciliation before clearing Congress. In New York, a week after the Office of Cannabis Management announced that locations for 105 open retailers and dozens of applicants have been approved according to an incorrect interpretation of proximity laws, a Senate Democrat, Leah Sera, filed a bill which would grandfather in existing licensees. The bill, if passed, would mean that a licensee would be considered compliant for purposes of license renewal and continued operation at such location if they were approved by regulators before July 28, 2025, as long as their business location was found to be in compliance with standards used by the office at the time of such approval, regardless of such business location's proximity to a school property line. Chris Alexander, the former OCM chief, in an appearance on New York One, pushed back on Governor Hochul's characterization and criticism of the measurement methodology. Mr. Alexander said, "This wasn't an oversight, it wasn't a mistake, it was a choice." According to Mr. Alexander, Governor Hochul's office and other state agencies signed off on OCM's cannabis rule in 2023. Let's pause here for a few suggestions. First, it is clear that a fix should not solely look to grandfather in those with existing site approvals. The Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act should be amended to allow for all existing and future measurements to be consistent with the manner in which it was already being done by the agency. Otherwise, as the former executive director stated, not measuring in this manner would severely hamper the growth of licensed dispensaries within New York City. Second, policymakers should have a serious discussion on whether the notion of preserving a space, creating this moat around schools, is necessary in today's world. The MRTA is modeled on the Alcohol Beverage and Control Law, which itself was enacted in 1934 following the repeal of alcohol prohibition in 1933. We have to ask, are kids truly harmed by simply passing a dispensary on their way to school? Finally, OCM's non-enforcement against expired licenses may not be a sufficient short-term fix before the legislature acts. OCM and the Cannabis Control Board must figure out an appropriate way of extending the license terms of those operators who may expire before a legislative fix is enacted, as operators may face banking, insurance, and other critical issues if they operate with expired licenses. Finally, OCM has also now announced a pause in the long-awaited implementation of its seed-to-sale tracking system. As you may not know, when it comes to seed-to-sale tracking of cannabis, just about every state uses one of two companies, BioTrack or Metric. In the last week or so, Metric announced a strategic partnership with BioTrack through which a newly created entity called BT Government, Inc. will manage BioTrack's government-facing operations and will operate independently from Metric and BioTrack. BT will be led by BioTrack Chief Operating Officer Mo Afena, who I should say was a guest on episode 2 of Joint Session this year. On the heels of that announcement, OCM told licensees that the deadlines by which licensees must integrate with BioTrack no longer apply. OCM must evaluate system implications for both the agency and licensees and determine the extent to which this development affects seed-to-sale integration in New York. To make a full assessment, OCM is temporarily suspending the deadline by which cultivators and other licensees must integrate, OCM wrote in a bulletin. In other words, there's still no centralized seed-to-sale system for tracking legal cannabis in New York years after adult use sales went live. This creates vulnerability at a time when there are rampant concerns about inversion of unregulated, out-of-state products into the state's licensed industry. OCM knows the critical importance of New York having a seed-to-sale system in order to protect the integrity of the state's cannabis industry. The agency is actively working with the vendor and is committed to keeping the schedule as close as possible to the original integration timeline, OCM continued, adding that it expects to have more information in the coming weeks. Thanks to Cannabis Wire for the news. Check out Cannabis Wire at cannabiswire.com. Leah Sera is the Associate Dean of Recruitment, Admissions, and Integration and is also an Associate Professor of Practice, Science, and Health Outcomes Research at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, where she received a PharmD. She teaches several courses at the school's trailblazing Graduate Studies in Medical Cannabis program, including an introduction to medical cannabis history, culture, and policy, and an introduction to evidence-based medicine and the clinical uses of medical cannabis. Professor Serra is often invited to speak on cannabis therapeutics, pain management, and palliative medicine topics at professional pharmacy conferences and at medical centers such as the National Institutes of Health. Not sure that'll happen again anytime soon. However, we're fortunate to have her here on Joint Session. Welcome, Professor Serra.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, so want to tell us a little bit about the program. Who is the ideal candidate for this program?
The ideal candidate for the Graduate Studies in Medical Cannabis program, and we have both a Master of Science and graduate certificate, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but the ideal candidate is somebody who wants to advance the field of cannabis medicine. Mm-hmm. And we look for, very intentionally, look for a very diverse student cohort. Though we are a school of pharmacy, it's not just pharmacists who are students in our program. We do have clinicians, of course, pharmacists, physicians, nurses, but we also have scientists, so folks with background in microbiology or in chemistry or biochemistry. And we also have students who don't have a clinical or science background, attorneys, public health professionals, a lot of entrepreneurs and business professionals, and students with a humanities background. So we really are looking for, the main thing is a passion and a desire to advance the field of cannabis medicine.
All right. Am I correct to think that this is the first in the nation program for medical cannabis in pharmacy?
This was the first master's program in the nation dedicated to the comprehensive study of medical cannabis, yeah.
All right. Well, can you walk us through what the program includes?
Sure. So the Master of Science program is a 2-year, 30-credit, part-time program, and students take courses in the endocannabinoid system, the pharmacology of cannabinoids and the cannabis plant. As you said, I teach the first course in the program, which is a survey course about the history of cannabis, primarily in the U.S., but also an introduction to cannabis policy. I also teach students how to evaluate medical literature. It's a hugely important skill to have in the field of cannabis medicine. Students have the opportunity to take electives in the program depending on their individual, professional, and academic goals. These electives can be advanced courses in the basic sciences like analytical chemistry and cannabinoids, or in the clinical sciences, so advanced therapeutics courses. If students are interested in research, they can take a course in research in cannabis medicine. So there are a lot of options to really personalize your education in this program.
You teach a course on evidence-based medicine and clinical uses of medical cannabis. How do you address the challenges of teaching evidence-based practices in a field where traditional clinical research has been historically limited due to federal restrictions?
That's a great question, and I think one of the reasons that I personally feel it's so critical for anybody working in this field to understand how to evaluate medical literature is because it's been so challenging to for researchers to perform what we would consider in our culture, the gold standard
Mhm.
in clinical research, which is randomized, controlled, double-blind clinical trials. There are a lot of reasons that it's very difficult to do in the U.S. Right now. It doesn't mean that there's not research going on. There's still research going on in the U.S. With clinical research and observational research, and there's also research going outside the U.S. But in order to distill all of this information down to evaluate what's reliable and valid, how do we apply this to a patient that's in front of us, when we have to do a lot of extrapolating. That is why that skill in particular is so critical and why we teach it to all of the students pretty early on in our program.
And what kind of practical training, lab work or clinical experience do students receive?
So we don't have any hands-on experiences with cannabis. We're a public institution, and so there are some limitations to what activities we can do within our program.
What are those limitations, and what has placed those limitations on the school?
Sure. The primary limitation in our curriculum is that students don't have any hands-on experience with the cannabis plant. So we and in our school and in our university, we don't do any research with with cannabis itself.
Mhm.
The reason for that is because, of course, cannabis is still a Schedule One substance, and because there's concern at the university level about protecting, for instance, our students' ability to access federal financial aid.
Mm.
So we have to be conservative in that way. That's the primary limitation. We also don't teach courses on the business of cannabis,
Mm.
so that we, cannot potentially be seen as aiding and abetting in the distribution of what is still a Schedule One substance. So those are the primary limitations, but the things that are, and we also don't teach students how to cultivate cannabis. I would say that's the third thing. So we Which it makes sense because we're not an agricultural school, we're a pharmacy school, so agriculture is not really in our wheelhouse anyway. What is in our wheelhouse is to teach students about the pharmaceutical science related to the cannabis plant and cannabinoids, to teach students about patient care and how to think about cannabis as a tool in our toolbox of medicines that can be used to improve the lives of people who need help,
Mm.
and to think about policies, health policies related to medical cannabis that can advance the field, and again keeping patients at the center of everything that we do, as we do with all of our programs at the University of Maryland. We're really taking our expertise as pharmacists, clinicians, and pharmaceutical scientists, to teach the things that we know best, within our areas of expertise.
Can you give examples of the kinds of research or the practical problems that students are tackling?
So the kinds of things that students learn are, as I said, we're not a thesis-based master's program, so students don't do research per se as part of our program. Certainly, we have students that are interested in research and have gone on to do research at other institutions after graduating, and we have many students, as I said, who are clinicians who may go back and advance or expand their practices with the knowledge that they've used in our program, whether as certifying physicians in a state that where medical cannabis is legal, or just by increasing their ability to communicate and educate their own patients on the benefits and potential risks of using cannabis as medicine. But within the program, topics that we um, focus on are, you know, how does how do cannabinoids, the chemicals within the cannabis plant that have biological action, how do they work? Why do they work? What are the biological systems that are involved? Starting with the endocannabinoid system, we really think of this and we teach this in the same way that we teach about medicines, for instance, in our Doctor of Pharmacy program. You start with what is the biology that enables these chemical compounds to have, a physiological effect. You start there. Then you go, and we really teach a lot of this from the ground up because we don't require our students to have a background in, say, chemistry or biology. And many of our students haven't taken, a chemistry course since high school, and that's fine. And we intentionally design this program to be accessible to all students, regardless of their, academic background. So we're teaching things like pretty advanced topics like pharmacology, medicinal chemistry, really from the ground up. What is a receptor? What is an enzyme? What do those things mean? And how do we advance from there to really understand the actions of the cannabis plant? And from there, understanding the medical literature, how it applies to different patients. And then students can, again, explore all of these topics in more detail in elective coursework. Another thing that is really important to us and is really a foundation of our program is teaching our students how to pay their education forward by educating others. And so students complete a capstone project. So they don't do a research thesis, but they do a capstone project. And that capstone project is based in instructional design, which is basically a systematic way to develop educational or instructional activities. And because I'm an educator myself, and I have a master's degree in instructional systems development, this is a project that is probably one of the favorite projects and courses that I developed for the program. Students work with an outside entity, an organization, or an individual to assess an educational need and develop educational content related to medical cannabis. So it's something that is very tangible, that they can include in a portfolio, and that instructional design is an additional skill that our graduates can then, use, put on their resumes and use to advance their own careers.
Can you give an example or two of those recent capstone projects?
Sure. So students choose their own organization to work with. They're not assigned an organization. And so it's really based on, their interests and their connections. They can choose to do this independently, or they can work with a small group of students. We've had students do projects with clinicians in local medical practices, with community organizations, with dispensaries, or other organizations within the kind of cannabis industry as you think about it. And we've also had students do projects with larger organizations. We had a student do a project with Normal. We had a student do a project with AARP. We had a student do a project with the Federal Council for Cannabis Regulation. So it's really up to the student, and then up to the student and the organization to determine the scope of the project and what the project looks like. And it could be something like a lecture or a series of lectures or a pamphlet or a booklet. Again, it really depends on what the needs of that organization are. And that's what we hope to teach the students so that they can then go out and, not just do one thing over and over again, but reach out and connect with different individuals, different entities, understand how to assess, the potential audience for, communication or for an educational activity, and then develop something that's really going to meet their needs.
And this is not a residential program, right? This is an online remote program.
That's right. This is it's a primarily online asynchronous program. All the courses are online, and by asynchronous, I mean that, we don't have class every Wednesday evening from 3 to 5 online. You have to log on. No, these are generally the content is posted and students can access the content whenever it's convenient for them, of course, as long as they're meeting assignment deadlines and things like that. But most of the students, the majority of the students in our program are working professionals. That's why this is a part-time program. We do require students in our master's program to come to campus once a semester on our campus in Rockville, Maryland, for a symposium. That is when all of the students regardless of whether they're here in Maryland, whether they're out of state, whether they're across the country, and we have international students as well. We all come together. It's a day where they can meet each other in person, which I think is so important in an online program where you're really usually just seeing, if you communicate with people at all, it's as a name, on a computer screen. And we have seminars from industry professionals. We have panel discussions. There are breakout sessions. We do a ton of networking at these. We have an extremely engaged alumni population, and we have over 700 alumni in our program, and many of them are so interested in coming back, giving back to the students. They form their own alumni association, and so especially in an industry that is really rapidly growing and evolving, having those professional connections is just critically important to the development of your own professional identity and your own career. And so we provide those opportunities for students at these symposiums.
What career opportunities are available for graduates of the program?
The career opportunities that are available for our graduates are varied. Because the students that are in our program are so, diverse in terms of their previous experience, their academic experience. So a lot of what they do depends not only on the education that they receive in our program, but what their previous professional and academic experience is. So we have students who, are clinicians who come to our program who will still be clinicians, doctors, pharmacists when they come out of the program, but may have either, more experience or may add, different certifications or services to the clinical services that they already provide. And I said we have a lot of students with entrepreneurial aspirations. And so students may go on to start their own, consulting companies or other companies. We have students who, as I said, have gone on to be a part of research labs. We have students who come and they do a total, kind of career change. We had one student who came in our first cohort who had experience in food service. And when she graduated from the program, she got a job in an analysis, doing analysis in a lab facility. And that's what she's been doing since then. So there are a lot of options, but a lot of it's not as straightforward as if, say, you come to pharmacy school and you come to our Doctor of Pharmacy program, and when you come out, you're a pharmacist. That's a very straight path. So this is not often as straight or obvious a path, and that's why things like the networking, getting to know not only your peers, but also our alumni, connecting with other people in the industry is just so important, and why we create those opportunities for our students.
Yeah, no, and I've actually met two people affiliated with your program. One was a student last October at a conference, cannabis conference in Georgia, and then the other is a nurse in Maryland, and she reached out after I had an episode earlier this year with the cannabis administrator from Maryland, and the graduate from your program reached out. So pretty interesting. So before the program existed, how were people trained in medical cannabis?
There was likely a lot of just personal motivation to go out and find, the information. There were very few formal education programs. There were some certificate programs. There were no master's programs dedicated to medical cannabis at the time. In terms of education that healthcare professionals get, it's still not common for cannabis medicine or the endocannabinoid system to be included in, say, like medical school curricula or even pharmacy school curricula, although it is becoming more common now. And one of the things that led to the creation of the program was that around 2017, um, when our former dean, Dr. Natalie Eddington, conceived of this project, this new academic program, was that a number of studies, surveys had been published in the medical literature, detailing that healthcare professionals, one, didn't learn it, and two, didn't know how to communicate with patients because they didn't have information, what they felt was credible information, didn't understand cannabis well enough to be able to answer the questions that patients were coming to them with. And so that was an impetus for creating the program, along with just seeing that, here in Maryland and throughout the nation, this industry was just exploding. And the reason that we, from the beginning, decided that we weren't going to just make this a program for healthcare professionals or clinicians, that we were going to open it up to anyone who wanted to be involved in the industry, is because there are so many moving parts to this industry, and that we didn't see, and we did a little bit of market research in advance of developing the program, that this sort of formalized training or education existed in any of the kind of relevant fields. And so we wanted to create something that, would give anyone, no matter whether they're going into, directly, into direct patient care, whether they are going to be opening up a dispensary, whether they're going to be developing healthcare, health policy related to cannabis, that they all have the same foundation, which is based in science, and can kind of go from there, use that to create these, rational policies and decisions based in science.
So when it comes to clinicians, can you give an example of how this education results in better patient care or decision making?
Patients now are increasingly looking for clinicians who want to participate in more of a shared decision-making model, rather than, kind of our more traditional paternalistic system where, the clinician makes a decision and then the patient follows their instructions, right? And so this, I think as a society, our increased interest in alternative medicines and alternative treatments, including cannabis, says to me that, patients want, medicine to look different in the US, and how they want relationships with clinicians to look different. And cannabis is just a great example of this kind of shared decision making process. And so clinicians who come through our program, you know, I think that most of the clinicians who come to our program already have that sense of, I want to be able to meet the patient where they are. Even though this is an, complementary or alternative, path of medicine, however you want to say it. We're not talking about, I'm not, an FDA approved medicine for your blood pressure, right? Which is, very, kind of cut and dry.
Mhm.
This is more complicated, and it requires more discussion, more follow-up, more interaction. And so clinicians who come through our program will be more knowledgeable. They should feel more comfortable entertaining these questions, and also doing so without the stigma that I think a lot of healthcare professionals have as it relates to cannabis, that makes patients afraid to be honest, and to come to them with questions, because they don't want to be labeled as drug seeking or as somebody with a substance abuse problem.
In the patient care, do you find that physicians are the first ones to raise the cannabis issue, or are patients the ones that are coming in and asking about the benefits of cannabis?
I think that doctors and patients are both talking about it, but they're coming at it from different angles.
Mhm.
I still think that when a lot of healthcare professionals are asking about cannabis use, they're asking about cannabis use from an angle of trying to determine if there's a risk for substance abuse, or if there's active substance abuse. Whereas when patients come with questions, it is, more likely to be about, you know, would this be a good treatment for my medical condition?
Right. So overall, how does the program work to professionalize the cannabis industry? Is it having an impact?
Well, we certainly hope so. You know, because this was, a risk that at the time there were no programs, and the university really put a lot of trust in us to develop this program, and putting the University of Maryland, Baltimore, and the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy name behind it. We hope that what we're saying by doing that is that we know that this is medicine, and we are treating this and teaching about this the same way that we teach about all of our medicines. And this is not, going to cure all ills. It's also not, as terrible as many people will, still think that it is. It's somewhere in the middle. Just like any medication, there's benefits and there's risks. And, one of my goals is I would love for medical cannabis to be as boring as aspirin, right? Aspirin is, not very controversial. We just know that it's a medicine. Does it have potential risks? Sure. Does it have benefits? Sure. That's my goal, is I want people to think about cannabis in that way. It can be a medicine. Obviously, there's a lot more involved in cannabis than that, right? But, I want people to, understand that this is medicine, and that we can teach about it, and that we can think about it in a really scientific and clinical way.
All right. Well, thank you. This has been a terrific discussion. I really appreciate you taking the time today.
Well, it was delightful. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a great rest of your summer before you get back to school.
Thank you. Have a great summer.
That's it for this episode of Joint Session Diverse Voices in New York State Cannabis. If you found today's discussion valuable, consider leaving a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. It helps more listeners find the show. Better yet, share it with colleagues, advocates, and anyone interested in the future of cannabis in New York. Joint Session is produced by me, Herb Barbot, together with executive producer Robert Curtis from Simlev Media. Special thanks as always to Cannabis Wire. You can follow us on Instagram at jointsession.pod and on LinkedIn at Joint Session Podcast. If you have any comments, questions, or topic suggestions, reach out to me at herb.jointsession@gmail.com. Until next time, this is Herb Barbot. Thanks for listening.